My name is Julia Stewart-David, and I'm organisationally from ECHO, the European Commission's Humanitarian Aid Department. But you'll be glad to know that my role today is moderating. And I'm really pleased, after the very rich discussion we had this morning, to be bringing you, I think, onto a continuation, in a sense, onto this particular role for governments in humanitarian innovation. And I know that some of our panellists want to talk quite widely about the issue. So without further ado, let me introduce at this end Anita Mengetti from the US State Department, Jelte van Meeren, who many of you heard yesterday making a defense of symmetry, I think. So we hear from Jelte again from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mohammed Aga, from the International Humanitarian City in Dubai, and last but not least, Joe McRae from the United Kingdom's Department for International Development. And I think they're trying to speak on behalf of entire government, but how much they reflect their official positions or their personal views, they will tell you themselves. Like the other panels that have been taking place here, I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes for some introductory remarks. But we will try, I think, after that to address what you would like to hear. So I may take the first few questions from the audience a little earlier than some of the other panels. We're starting late, and we will try nonetheless to still finish in time for plenty of conversation over lunch. So please, I think we were going to start with Jelte.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to say a few things about, what we as a government can do in terms of stimulating innovation in the humanitarian sector, and what actually the purpose is, and why do you think it is important. Let me first tell you that in the Netherlands, innovation in the humanitarian sector is not only something that we think is important to do, but it's also a stated priority in our humanitarian policy since last year, September. For a number of reasons, but the main reason is that we think that based on what we see in practice and the problems that we're facing in the increasing amount of humanitarian cases and the lack of humanitarian action to solve all of that, is that innovation is a possibility to get closer to humanitarian effectiveness, for which I think is the ultimate goal for most of us around the table. In doing so, I think governments like mine have a very specific role to play, not only being a donor and being able to put money into innovation in the first place, but in the second place, we also have a possibility of using convening power at a national level, at an international level, using political figureheads like ministers, prime ministers and others, is to get parties to come together to think through and to come up with clear ideas and structures how innovation could actually work. We have a number of very interesting examples in the Netherlands. I'll just mention one, and it's not in the humanitarian sector, but we have a very interesting sort of incubation innovation model which is working in the creative sector, like the organization of the big dance and pop events, etc., which in the Netherlands is one of the top economic sectors. We are, I think, big in the world of that kind of thing. And there is a system convened by the government, not by us, but by the Ministry of Economic Affairs, bringing together startups, young, bright, new, upcoming private sector entities, academia, individuals, bringing forward their ideas, nurturing that in sort of an incubator system, and then at the end, and this is a very important part of it, using big companies in terms of the creative sector to actually pilot these ideas, make sure that they work, and then help them to scale them up to a level where they can become part of the practice of becoming more sustainable, more effective, more efficient, etc. This kind of model needs a neutral broker, which makes sure that these systems are not sort of hampered by commercial reasons, that people are not actually fighting over resources very much, but they keep on being open-ended and they serve the common good. And I think that is something where a government can be of fundamental importance. Now, bringing that to an international level, we see all sorts of possibilities for a group of countries that really believe in innovation to become a productive and a supporting player on an international level on innovation in the humanitarian sector.
Thank you very much. Anita, would you like to come in on this?
Yes, I'll also be, I hope, painfully brief. We just produced the State Department, and I'm going to start out by saying, no, I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire US government. I cannot even name all of the agencies of the US government, and I've worked for it for a very long time. I'm going to limit myself pretty much to the State Department and USAID to some extent. And I'm actually going to go back a year in time and say that the innovation, just the conversation was incredibly new to me last year when I came, but I was here. And I went away with 6 takeaways. One of them was from Pear, IKEA. Innovation should improve on a product or process by making it more efficient or effective for less money. Innovation requires an enabling environment, room to fail, dedicated resources, time, mindset, and leadership. Innovation is not just things, gadgets, apps. And I remember the gentleman from Luxembourg talking about that they had managed to come up with a 6-year funding cycle. There are theories and types of innovation, iterative, disruptive, and different ways of soliciting it, directed open. Challenges to humanitarian innovation, public money, private lives. People, and then my last one was something about the conference itself, which was, we still need to remember that we have differences among us. All the techies assumed I understood what they were saying. I didn't. All the academics assumed I had read the last 50-page report on something. I hadn't. And all the humanitarians were drowning in their own humanitarian soup most of the time with the acronyms. But what is the US government's role in promoting or engaging in humanitarian innovation? It's all of those things I just talked about. It's trying to figure out, how do we as a government open up more? How do we promote new ideas? How do we not recruit ourselves and think about the means? I also would say that we are trying to look at innovation writ large with various applications. So I'm a big proponent of what I've heard so far in this conference, talking that maybe we're hamstringing ourselves by talking about humanitarian innovation as opposed to innovation that can be utilized to humanitarian ends or that has humanitarian applications. I know it's much longer to say that, but I think we silo ourselves. I could go into great detail about many, many things that we're doing, but thanks to all of you who have been mentioning some of the things already in your sessions. We've come a long way in providing maps and data and aerial views to people. We have more contests now, both for inside our agencies to come up with public goods and bringing people from the outside. A statistic I found very interesting recently was with the DIV, the Development Challenge, of the applications that were received, and there were 6,000 proposals in 2014, 66% of those proposals were from entities that had never worked with USAID previously. So in and of itself, I think opening up this level is going to create a whole bunch of synergies that can be very good. I'm going to stop there with the exception that I would also, as a private tax-paying US person, be very interested in any ideas, thoughts people have about breaking some glass on the international humanitarian system. I think we're seeing increased redundancies and mandates, and I think that maybe it's time. I'm not going to say give up on an international system. I think we just have to recreate it the next week, but I think that it's time to really shake things up.
Discussion. So, Mohammed, would you like to come in?
Absolutely, thank you. Again, Mohammed Aga, Programs and Development with the International Humanitarian City in Dubai. Just a little bit of a background. The entire attention to the humanitarian sector started long ago in the United Arab Emirates. The late Sheikh Zayed has always said that the rich has to help the poor, that prosperity is the right of all. Now, Dubai being in the center of the world geographically, and with high capacity and soft and hard infrastructure in terms of logistics, the International Humanitarian City was established in 2003, 12 years ago, with a single aim to be a very effective large hub for humanitarian warehousing and logistics. 12 years down the road now, as we witness the evolution of the humanitarian sector and the growth of demand and the continuous shortfall with delivery, we thought we should scale it up and take it to the next level. Under the direction of the leaders, a strategy for 6 years, 2015-2021, was launched with focus on 4 main pillars: connectivity, innovation, partnership, and leadership. And throughout yesterday and today's sessions, I've picked on a number of items where the academic community, the private sector, the NGOs and the agencies in the field are all interested in delivering more. And Anita, as you said, we need to reinvent the humanitarian sector. We don't need humanitarian innovation, we need to deploy innovation for the humanitarian sector. With that, we have focused on sustainable partnerships with the private sector and with the academic community to create innovation labs, to disseminate the knowledge, transform our logistical hub today into a center for knowledge. We have a forum that will be held every 2 years where cases such as Yeltes might be exposed and given an open invitation by all the parties that can scale it up to participate. We have innovation labs where we pinpoint good projects that are struggling in terms of funding, possibly infrastructure. Again, to test it, we can support testing it through our multi-agency platform. We have around 60 agencies in our building, 9 of them is United Nations. We have work with ECHO, your commissioner is on our advisory council, etc. So we have a very rich platform that we can deploy for small ideas that can be effective or large ideas that can be expanded. I mean, we really want to deploy the entire capacity towards the sector. For partnership, we are engaging the private sector on 2 main levels. The first one is to start talking their language, and we've touched on that yesterday in terms of the World Humanitarian Summit that's coming up. We're looking towards what's beyond the summit. And we actually, we had talks with UNOCHA in terms of using our forum that will be held every couple of years, starting September 2016, to be a stepping stone for the summit. Let them decide whenever they want if there will be a second or a latter summit. But our forum, and other forums as well, can be used to be the checkpoint. So what's going to happen in 2 years, and then what's going to happen in 4 years, and what is our lesson learned, and how can we actually transform the calls for action into actual projects. Also, we launched what we call the Global Humanitarian Impact Fund, a readiness fund. And lastly, we formed a unique advisory council chaired by the leader of Dubai and includes the UAE Commissioner, the head of the Arab League, the head of the GCC, and a number of heads of UN agencies such as WFP, UNOCHA, etc. Also to meet every year and look backwards and see what worked and what couldn't work, and again, transform calls for actions into actual projects. Shortly, the role of government with that entire story is an enabler. The government cannot be a donor only, and it cannot be just a regulator. It has to deploy the financial and the regulatory capacity into becoming an enabler. With the UAE's unique position as a soft political player in the world and a very neutral political and economic driver, we believe that we can try to pull some strings and help the sector develop more and push it higher again as an enabler more than any other category, because we believe that all goes under the enablement topic.
So much. And Joanne?
Great, thank you very much. I mean, it's always handy coming last, because then all the good bits have been said and you can kind of repeat them and look as clever as your colleagues. But I mean, I suppose the way that we started to invest seriously in humanitarian innovation around 2010, and I think what we've been trying to do increasingly as our sort of interest in this space has grown, is, as others have said, to sort of look at our role systemically. And I think this concept around the ecosystem that you need to have in place to support humanitarian innovation is very helpful. And indeed, increasingly, I'm wondering whether we should be stopping talking about a humanitarian system and be talking about a humanitarian ecosystem and how innovation fits within that. And when I think about ecosystems, I always remember when I kind of first learnt about these at school, and we were looking at ponds, and it was explained to us around how the little algae, there were the algae, and there were the little fish that ate the algae, and then there were the bigger fish that ate the fish that ate the algae. And one of the things I think that my teachers managed to communicate to me at that time was that ecosystems are very fragile, that if you intervene in those ecosystems, you can intervene helpfully or you can intervene quite unhelpfully. And I think as donors, we're trying to find those kind of Goldilocks moments, to try to slightly mix my metaphors, where we're intervening just the right amount in just the right ways. And like Sarah early on, I'm often quite cautious about how much we should be asking donors to fix a bunch of problems. But I do think there are some roles that we can helpfully play. And I think there are three roles that I think we should be playing as donors to try and increase the health of those ecosystems. And they're these. So I think the first thing we need to be doing is encouraging a culture of innovation, and in particular to be giving very clear messages about what kind of risk we will and we won't tolerate. And we had a long conversation around this in the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, where I was trying to explain that we were tolerant of failure. So it was okay if we invested in 10 projects and only one succeeded and delivered something really valuable. But what we meant by failure was different. Was we wanted what we were calling responsible failure. So inevitably, when you innovate, not everything's going to work, almost by definition. But it's making sure that the management of those processes is professional and effective, and you're able to recognise failure. So the first thing we need, I think, to do is to have a culture where innovation is encouraged, and I think we need to be encouraging investment in research and development, not necessarily out of humanitarian assistance, but to address humanitarian issues. So I think shifting the culture around in favour of innovation and encouraging risk-taking is the first thing. The second thing, which is slightly more obvious, is that we need to make finance available. But just having enough money isn't enough. What we're finding is that the way in which you design those investment instruments is incredibly important and is actually very complex. And so as donors, we have a responsibility to understand how the design of those financing mechanisms helps or hinders the ecosystem. And then the third one, which colleagues have really talked about, is around our role in convening and accelerating innovation. And I think what we've seen is a number of really important innovations that have got stuck for political economy issues. The one that we're working on at the moment is with regard to cash, where there's compelling evidence that cash-based approaches are brilliant, but we've only managed to reach about 3 to 6% of humanitarian assistance being delivered through cash. That's because there are major political economy issues that are blocking scale up. So we've got a tiny little investment, like under $100,000, which is really trying to convene people in a kind of political economy type sense, and to think through what are the institutional changes that are needed to unlock that previous investment in innovation. So I guess that's our kind of increasingly, we're trying to get, as a donor, trying to leverage our role, not just in terms of money that we have within DFID, but also across government. And then also, as others have described, kind of use the leverage that we have politically to bring people together. So I think it's very much in common with this morning. There's a real political economy around innovation, and understanding that and navigating that's really key to success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I heard a lot of things that I think we can take the conversation around. Convening power policy highlighted, the scaling, the bigger issue of breaking the glass, as I need to put it. You know, are we part of a very changing system? How do we deal with that? International champion partnership, practical questions, investment, and capacity. And risk that we've just said. And I found it very interesting that that Joe went automatically into donor mode as opposed to government mode. And this, of course, yesterday I was in a very interesting session about how you ask the right questions around evidence. So if I may put the colleagues on the spot, as government representatives, not necessarily for your own government, but having heard the discussion we had this morning about failure of government, could we just take a moment in the first round of questions to look at where governments are actually hindering innovation in humanitarian aid? And who would like to start on that? It doesn't necessarily, I should add, need to be your own government.
I'll take that.
Okay,
I'll
great.
take that. I'll give a couple of examples. Government is financial resources, regulatory capacities, and a lot of bureaucracy. When deployed properly, it is of a lot of aid, and I will just share a case for that. And when it's not, then it hinders innovation. It actually stumbles the entire humanitarian supply chain. Two examples that are recent in natural disasters with Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu. Like any other crisis, we call in our task force, which is representatives of different international agencies, as well as our management. We sit together when a crisis hits, and we start talking about what is needed, what is available, how can we deliver it, or how can we respond in general. So with Vanuatu, because of the flexibility, which flexibility on its own is an act of innovation, when you try to maneuver around processes and ensure that you can get to make the right decision in time, we were able to coordinate with the Australian government and the Malaysian government, have a Boeing 747 lift out of Dubai, 40 metric tons, load up another 40 metric tons in Kuala Lumpur, land in Brisbane, offload into two C-130s and a number of ships, and just head towards Vanuatu in less than 24 hours. So just the act of realizing a crisis and cooperating to let aid arrive quickly through government leadership, legitimacy, and regulatory powers, then you have somehow created a new process that did not exist to respond to a crisis. And with the humanitarian sector, and while dealing with the unexpected, we have to be flexible and we have to be innovative. On the other side, with the unfortunate earthquake in Nepal, again, the task force meets, around 500 metric tons are ready to go out, just out of Dubai. I mean, from the different agencies, the global agencies that store their aid in our warehouses. 500 metric tons were there, 5 airlifts were donated by the government, 3 airlifts were provided by our private sector partner, UPS. None of them could go in time. And a week later, the Nepalese finance minister goes on CNN and shouts out loud that what they need is not coming. So whatever actually arrived was not what they really needed. And then time after that, and 4,000 lives that has passed, we realized that the air traffic congestion in the airport, and I mean the whole story that everyone knows in the room, was because of lack of readiness, although the earthquake was forecasted 3 years earlier. So again, because of lack of, I wouldn't call it commitment. I'm sure governments are committed. I'm sure they are. But the sector overwhelms all the parties, and unless we act in a catalyst behavior, at least when the crisis hits, we try to overcome obstacles. When the Nepalese cannot receive aid, then maybe the Indians can let the airlifts land there. I mean, we won't get into politics, but there was India, there was China around Nepal, and we could have done something. But again, government bureaucracy, lack of readiness hindered any innovative approach through private sector partnership, government donations, or multi-agency coordination. All of that was ready. None of it was able to be implemented. So.
I know Joe wanted to come in, and then Yelta. Joe?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's fair to say that sometimes there are mixed incentives around innovation. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that you have to be quite patient. And these are to really get ideas through from the initial phase of ideation through to stuff happening at scale is a 10 to 15 year project. And I think sometimes that time scale and actually the level of investment and risk that you need to take to do that is bumping up against also a need to be doing something today and tomorrow. And also the tension between knowing that if you pull a particular lever, you will get a particular set of results. That's a very seductive level of certainty, as opposed to, oh, I wonder what will happen if we try this. And so I think there is a genuine tension that is not badly meant, but is the reality about how you're trying to, on the one hand, address today's problems, whilst also trying to plan for the future. And I think that's a very profound, that tension plays itself out not only in the way we fund, and I think actually what I was trying to say was that in terms of, I didn't mean to slip into donor mode, I think at all, in fact what I was trying to say was I think there are many different ways in which we incentivize change, some of which we do through our very specific funding decisions that have a particular weight, but the others around political permission and around the vision that Anita described. But there are quite big tensions, I think, in terms of time and in terms of tolerance for risk in certain contexts.
Yes, thank you. I would like to focus on a bit of a different aspect in terms of the role of government in actually blocking progress on a fundamental issue that we're all dealing with, and that is not the way we deal with disasters or deal with crises afterwards or during the crisis, but to come to the fore of these crises and dealing with prevention and preparedness. This is an issue very, very difficult to deal with for governments. Governments internationally are based on political systems, and political systems depend on public support, at least in most of the countries in the world. In a system like that, it is very interesting for a politician to be involved, to be seen to be involved in disaster response or crisis response. You get acknowledgement, support, you are becoming visible, and it does something good for your chances of being re-elected the next time there is an election. However, in terms of preparedness and prevention, that trigger is not there, because investing in prevention is politically not really interesting to do, because you cannot actually prove that something didn't happen because you invested in it, preventing it from happening. There's a political disincentive in getting involved. So the only real chance we have internationally to get really serious about prevention issues, about preparedness issues, is after there's been a major crisis and politicians are being called to the fore, to be able to say to them, your response has been below the level that we would like it to be, and therefore this is now the chance to correct yourself and get involved in prevention and in preparedness. A very small window of opportunity under the sort of overall saying that never waste a good crisis. You can actually get political incentives when there has been a crisis. This limits the international possibilities for getting in front of a crisis enormously. How to solve that, I don't know, but the political system of governance internationally doesn't really help them.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything on this one?
There's so many examples of how we get in our own way. I'm just trying to choose one that won't get me fired.
Feel free to talk about somebody else.
I would actually say, I'll talk about my own. One of the ways we limit ourselves, maybe it's not so much the failure, but it's the failure to thrive or the failure to capitalize on, is that, again, we are a very large government, and like all large bodies, you hive off into little select groups. And we, a lot of times, don't share information across our government as readily as we should. And so what you find is that, two parts of the government are funding the same, We've gotten a lot better about that over the years. But I would say that sometimes just the size of our government sometimes inhibits our leanness and our efficiency. And as you know, large bureaucracies do not tend to be good incubators of new ideas. Large bureaucracies that run on public resources even less, because there is always someone very happy to put your failure up in the New York Times for our sake, or the Washington Post. So I would say, and there are many examples that I'm sure you can all talk about, I know that some policies of the US government greatly inhibited ability to respond to famine in Somalia. Those weren't policies strictly about innovation, but I think sometimes it boils down to how do you weigh countervailing priorities? How do you try to not fund terrorists at the same time you're trying to feed starving people? And sometimes those both incredibly, in my mind, legitimate desires become at a cross purpose. And again, it's something I know we're addressing, my colleagues in the international organizations part of the State Department. We expend a lot of energy in our own government trying to figure out what other parts of our government are doing sometimes. And I think that in and of itself takes away from some of the innovative things that we could be doing. But there's effort. But just to say that sometimes I think we're our own worst enemy.
Thank you. Yes, I can see that we're going to leap into a next round of discussion on I think, how we enable ourselves, if I can put it this way, between governments to coordinate our efforts. And if I may link that also, please, in your interventions to how it is you come to prioritise on the particular aspects that you highlighted in your introductory statements. So, Joe, you wanted to react straight away, because what I heard was about conflicting priorities and that governments are responsible for many things, including humanitarian aid.
So I suppose, I mean, again, I think it's kind of being clear what donors should and also what they shouldn't be doing. So I think in terms of how we coordinate better, it's about being clear what we're coordinating about. So I'm not quite sure we should, we need to be very specific about which bits of the sort of innovation cycle we want to involve ourselves in. I mean, if you focus quite narrowly on the prioritization process, I guess what we've tried to do bilaterally is to very much work with our field-based colleagues and to identify kind of what are the big operational issues that they're struggling with on the one hand, and then also be trying to look a little bit further out, because they're obviously dealing with today's problems, so we're trying to sort of anticipate what tomorrow and the day after's problems will be. I think what we found very difficult is it takes a lot of effort to do that bilaterally, and I think what we would welcome is a facility or a mechanism where we could be able to kind of share wisdom, not just between donors, but between a wider group in terms of that agenda setting. And I think the other spaces that we'd like to not necessarily coordinate between each other, but be collaborating and co-investing in, are mechanisms that can actually manage innovation better than we can, because I think one of the other things that hinders us in innovation is that our project management cycles are very, very lengthy, and we tend to be managing things on an annual project management cycle. Whereas I guess when I speak to innovation folks, they need a very different structure for short-term kind of, is this working, recheck, come back. So I think it's about collaborating on problem definition and on design of investment vehicles and management vehicles, which we shouldn't be presuming to try to do ourselves.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
I'd just like to say quickly that USAID in particular has a lab, and they're doing a lot of work on innovation, and similarly I think actually to ECHO is launching a Global Innovation Exchange.com, and what you will find if you go look on that, it's in its beta version, is that it doesn't say USAID on it. It's just an open platform, and it can be humanitarian exchange, whatever. It's supposed to be toward developmental ends. But one of the things that they managed to do with some of these, and there are directed, and USAID challenges are on there as well as many, many others. But one thing that USAID managed to do is, again, if I agree, you're going to prioritize and what types of things you want to do, and you need to find out where your value added is, and where your value added isn't, you need to get out of the way. But we also have to innovate internally in order to keep up with this. And anyone that has ever received funding from USAID knows that it takes a while sometimes. And OFDA can actually get money out the door pretty darn rapidly. But for the rest of the building in particular, there are many, many, and there are very good reasons. There are reasons why we won't just fund vaccines. We have someone on staff that is a pharmacist vet the thing, because once, many, many, many years ago, some of the vaccines killed some children. I think it was 47 years ago, but anyway, there's a good reason to make it difficult to do that. But they managed to change the contracting period for giving out these awards pretty much from about 3 months down to about 35 days. And that's not bad for a government doing these things. And so I would just say, I agree that you have to have, and we now, USAID has directed and open challenges. And so what we're trying to find is, and varying amounts of money. Is this brand new, or are you trying to bring it to scale? I would say bringing things to scale is the bugbear all around in many of these issues. But one other aspect of that, again, is, and just drawing on personal experience, years ago, many years, I ran a volunteer program to assist Vietnamese Amerasian children. And what I found is, wow, everyone I recruited had a master's degree and this and that. Yeah, I basically recruited myself. And what you find with these sorts of things is that it really helps to, go to the beneficiaries themselves, and we're going, obviously, as USAID, the State Department, rarely going to do that directly. So that's where I would say NGOs, communities have to make that known. We can only do so much of that. But I think we need to do a better job, and we're trying to do a better job of really making it truly, in the true sense of the term, democratic and open. That, you know, whoever you are, if you want to go after this money, go after it, and then we will hopefully get out of your way.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yalta.
Just one addition, picking up from one of the things you said on scaling. This is one of the things when we got into the issue of innovation in the humanitarian sector. We didn't know anything about innovation in our team, so we were just pure amateurs. So what we did is we have a first really big round of discussions with people who really know what's going on, and trying to learn from that, and we formulated our policies based on all these discussions. And I think the first and the strongest lesson we've learned is it's not about trying to choose what you are going to do, it's more about choosing what you are definitely not going to do, getting out of the way of some of the issues that really don't need government involvement. And it was very, very clear from almost everybody we talked to in innovation, said if you have some money available, focus on those issues in the whole chain of innovation that is very difficult to do right now, especially the issue of scaling. Don't get in the way of all these new ideas that are coming up, let them develop. There are incubators around, there are ways to get your ideas from an idea stage up to a prototype stage, that we don't need you to get involved in that. If you have a limited amount of money available, try and work on the issue of, the final bit of piloting and scaling up into something that can be really used at an international level. So this is what we've written down in our policies, and this is what we're trying to implement. Now, the nice thing about that is that it sort of protects us also from a lot of things that are coming our way through political pressure. Just to give you an idea, once our policy was out, September last year, I think in the first couple of weeks we got phone calls, emails, letters, indications from, let's say, technically based, innovative product designing projects, most of them on drones issues, with huge budgets and a lot of need for money. I could have spent all of my money in the first 10 minutes after this policy was issued on these issues, and I would have very, very little defense against the political pressure and lobbying behind all of these initiatives. But we didn't do that. We told these people, read our letter to Parliament. It says we're not going to get involved into product development, so you have to knock on different doors. To me, that was absolutely a good thing that we've done, to focus on a different part of the whole chain. Now, it is just as complex to be involved in scaling, maybe even more complex than to be in product development. However, this is probably something where we can have an added advantage, not only by funding that, but also having people, putting them in a position to draw comprehensive and workable plans how to scale products that are potentially successful onto an international level, and then trying to use our convening power to getting other funders, bigger funders to come into the scaling issue and trying to do that.
Thank you. We're almost halfway, but I'm going to press Mohammed a little bit on the prioritization, not necessarily for your own government, but for governments in general, because you highlighted very effectively the hindrance examples that we've seen. And I think it was 2007, we had a very big process innovation around international disaster response law. Now, whose job is it in terms of government to government to make sure that we do effectively put some of the prioritization and resourcing onto this preparedness phase that you were so clearly highlighting as one of the issues?
It's the job of champions. Within the government, it is, I mean, let me draw a very simple example. The telecom industry. All the telecom operators around the world, if I don't want to generalize, but at least the most important ones are private sector. They're licensed by the government. They provide an excellent service. They make money. They share it with the government. Then they hand over the project if they may, or they keep it. So we achieve high impact, excellent performance. But then again, led by government. Now, when we talk about, this is an intergovernmental issue. Each government has to have a champion that works on this topic. And that champion must have the government knowledge, but also the awareness of the needs for the agencies in the field and the spirit of the private sector, so they can bring the private sector on board. No single party can do it on their own. The United Nations acknowledged that in 2000 when Kofi Annan launched the United Nations Global Compact. I myself worked on the compact for around 5 years in the MENA region, and there was a very clear acknowledgement that the UN and the governments cannot do it alone. They need the private sector on board. And of course, the UN, the government, and the private sector cannot do it alone because they need the NGO community as well. Today, we have to have a collective effort, but champions are required. And the governments, being the enabler and the regulator, must at least create a conducive environment for these champions to emerge. In our case, IHC is a government arm, but we operate with a very complex spirit that caters to the NGO community, brings along the private sector on the business case scenario. We don't operate on charitable basis at all. Any company we bring on board, they have to see the business case, the ecosystem that they are trying to plug into. And we have the government power. At the end of the year, everything we do is reported under MICAT, has the union's contribution. We deal with all the governments, not necessarily in the name of the government, but in the name of the sector.
Okay, thank you. And I think there'll be many people wanting to ask more about the work of that later. I did promise I would come in early, and it's very hard these days to tell whether those on computers are with us or are doing something else. I heard Yelta say one of government's hardest jobs is to know when not to get in the way. So while you're asking your questions, you can feel free to give an example of where you think government should get out of the way. I'm going to give a round, and I still have at least one more question myself. And I'm going to start with whoever puts their hand up furthest at the back and work down. Please, whoever's nearest at the back, don't feel pressured just because you're at the back. Okay, so I think there's this lady here. Oh, is that gentleman's got a half hand up? And please, if you have a little statement to make, do make the statement, but make it very short and try and focus on a question. And if you have a question to a particular member of the panel, please say who that is. Thank you.
Yes, madam. I will try and be short then. I will not make a statement because I spoke yesterday. I have, and I spoke about protracted displacement and the need to change the mindset from a humanitarian approach to a more comprehensive approach. And you guys have talked about governments as enablers and conveners, which I fully agree with. But you haven't talked about, unless I slept in class, which is possible, how you can actually, as governments, how you can engage with governments that need to have policy innovation or policy change in order that we can make a difference. Because I think we can innovate ourselves to death, but unless we see policy change to allow all the innovations to be implemented, we are really wasting our time. So I would like you to talk a bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take two and then take answers. So the second question, please.
Thanks very much. And actually, my question is very related to that. And I thought the idea around looking at innovation more broadly and innovation that can then be used for humanitarian systems was very interesting. So not limiting ourselves to humanitarian innovation per se. And I really wanted to get your perspectives more on the role of intergovernment relationships and bilateral aid in supporting host and affected governments to foster innovation and to make these policy changes that are needed, and also to have the funding to invest in innovation hubs and this enabling environment.
Okay, great. Who would like to kick off? Yeah, Yelta, please.
Just to react to Niels's question on the engagement with governments, I think it's an absolutely essential point of what I consider to be an innovative way of working. I mean, we are not used to, if we talk about, for instance, a different way to deal with large-scale migratory movements, we are not used to have that political dialogue with the governments of the countries where these people are as a fundamental part of our overall comprehensive approach. Yet, this is what needs to be done if you allow for space to be innovative in new approaches in these areas. We know that the traditional way of dealing with it, just providing aid to people who are in a certain place, doesn't work very long. We are coming into protracted situations, we need to go to solutions, etc. And then the dialogue, a proper dialogue with the governments of host countries, is an essential element of that. I mean, just imagine what it could mean for the situation around the Syria crisis, for the governments of Jordan and Lebanon, if we could find ways, deals with the national governments on how they could remove some of the restrictions on the refugees so that they become more self-reliant. This is a mainly political thing that needs to be discussed, and it cannot only be done by these governments based on pressure. Something has to come in return to them. This is a traditional way how governments deal with each other, both bilaterally, but also as an international community in cooperation with a government that is facing these problems. This is a missing thing so far as I can see. It's happening, but it's happening on a very, very small scale. I have some personal experiences quite recently. I will not mention the government's concern, but talking to governments that are ready to go to at lengths with regard to their own political internal situation and providing some more room for really creative solutions if we can help them out in solving something else. So this is a tit-for-tat sort of way of negotiation which should be scaled up to a larger degree in order to become more successful internationally.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Yelta's observations, and I think one of the challenges for us is that actually that requires that we as donors, or as donor governments, work quite differently, because I think quite a lot of the time we do emphasise our role as donors and assume that our job is primarily to fuel the international humanitarian system, as opposed to those that looking at, if you like, a much higher level of theory of change in terms of how we can use our leverage. And I think that's partly because we've been cautious about how we use our sort of bilateral capability in that, and sort of assumed that the UN is going to get on and do that for us. And I think that's been, we've probably learned by now that may not be, that we should also be kind of maximising that effect. I think one of the implications of that, though, will mean that we'll need quite a different, if you take that kind of more policy-based approach, it requires a very different configuration of capability. So even in terms of managing humanitarian assistance at country level, there's often quite limited capability for specific donors. To get involved in the kind of work you're talking about requires a very patient, diplomatically skilled workforce on the ground that's going to be working on that over a long period of time. And I don't think that's how we're configured. I don't think that's the business that we're designed to configure, to deliver right now. And so it will require a kind of beyond aid kind of configuration. Thanks.
I would say, Niels, and again, when you're looking at a humanitarian issue, but then you're talking as a government, it isn't necessarily the humanitarian part of that government that's going to address these long-term macroeconomic, highly political, security-related questions. So a lot of what I know my government to do is to, believe it or not, very quietly talk to people a lot. And at every chance that you get, And it's the ambassador to the prime minister in certain countries where threats about throwing refugees out of the country are ongoing. And again, it's difficult sometimes because, as you know, the ambassador covers every single issue that we have with that country and with the surrounding countries sometimes. But I have found increasingly that there is appetite at the political level, and I think it is because people are starting to see that long-term refugee populations are not good, not only for those populations, but for the country where they are, for the countries on the other side of the border. Let's look at Somalia and Kenya. Dadaab is a city. It used to not be a city. Economic growth is based on those refugees being there. There are some problems that come with that too, but also you can't talk about development in Somalia unless you talk about, what percentage of those people are ever going to go home. It's very intricate, but I think that as our government, people with more political interests have come to see that humanitarian crises are not just an opportunity to be on the front page handing someone a package, but that they actually have many knock-on effects. I think we've been able to get that on their radar and have them speak about those issues. Even when you have Secretary Kerry, very publicly having a video conference with refugees in a refugee camp during a very brief visit in a country sometimes, that elevates that and that lets that country know that we want to talk about this and we want to engage. And then when we have our OFDA and Food for Peace and PRM in there, also willing to talk to different ministries now and be a little broader about some of these long-term issues, I think that also helps. So I think the increasing sophistication of the humanitarians, realizing that sometimes you have to be political in order to have longer-term humanitarian impact, and our ability to message up to political leaders, I think, has improved over the last few years.
I think we're getting a great masterclass in humanitarian diplomacy, and maybe a reminder that we have to recognize our varied roles. We talked about the silos earlier. I was reminded by agronomists that silos can be useful too sometimes. So it's a question of knowing when they're useful and when they're not. Can I put the questions back up? And I'm still in the middle of the room at the moment. So I will come to the front. And if you're near the back and you've only just woken up, don't worry, you'll get another chance.
Good morning, my name is Erin, and my question sort of got asked, so I'm going to tweak it a little bit. It's interesting that you kind of are switching into a donor role as all of your countries that are represented are more so donor countries, but I'd be interested how you'd answer this question of what's the role for governments if you were sitting there from a host country's perspective, and how you are innovative and bring new things to your communities without the competing priorities of, often you look at the governments of Kenya or Lebanon or Jordan that have their public systems are highly strained, and you're trying to meet security concerns, and how you would be answering if you're one of these countries' governments and trying to bring innovative practices. And I know we do have some other governments sitting in the audience as well, so I think it's really, just coming from working from those countries, a very difficult space to work in. So thank you.
Thank you. May I take the second question? So I like the spirit. So in the all-star performance spirit, we're going to turn our government representatives into representatives of host governments in a minute in response to that question. But let's take the second question first. And by the way, regrettably, our colleague from Uganda who was due to join us ran into one of those other government responsibilities, visa issues. So, yeah.
Hi. There's a question really around how much, I know you've been looking at the ecosystem, how much you're thinking about structuring the whole market and the use of incentives, etc. And it's really interesting. Julia, you gave an excellent example of some of the problems of incentives by asking us all to walk to the front and then rewarding the people at the back by asking them the questions first. So if you're in a multiplayer game and game theory, next time I'm not going to move to the front. But it shows how incentives really structure behavior within a market. And so as you're looking at that as donors, what have your thoughts been in terms of not just the innovation ecosystem, but as you said, Joe, the whole ecosystem, how that could be potentially structured to facilitate innovation.
Thank you. Two great questions, slightly different, so I'll take them back. And by the way, the incentives were shaped by sitting with the designers at breakfast and noting how much time it was taking to get the mic around. So can we go to, I think everybody should have a go at the first question. So from a host country perspective, can you speak on behalf of it, not on behalf of, but as if you were a host country about innovation? Thank you. Mohammed.
I'll take that. From a host country perspective, and again, I'll pick Lebanon, the Syria-Lebanon example. The Lebanese government and people are overwhelmed with the Syrian influx. The population, the Syrian population that is in Lebanon right now, I mean, if we leave them to keep making babies for the next 2 years, I mean, the Syrians will be a majority in Lebanon. And the Lebanese government are overwhelmed with that. But the reaction is do nothing. And that's not right. Every refugee community has specific capacities. The host country must not necessarily invest in these capacities, but allow it to flourish, allow it to become productive, rather than leave it to be a burden and wait for the international community to provide aid and try to facilitate this large machine's work to provide a decent or at least a minimum way of living, to treat them legitimately as refugees. Try to allow them to become productive agents within the economy. In the Zatari camp, the Jordanian surroundings of, the geographical surroundings of little villages around the Zatari camp lack a lot of the services that are being provided in the Zatari camp. So why not create an ecosystem there? I mean, deploy the international aid, deploy it to the benefit of these villages, the local villages, to serve them and the refugee community. And this will actually create a bond between the two communities and allow the refugees to become more welcome rather than a burden. There has to be a political will to go down that line rather than deal with the refugees as a crisis on top of their own crisis. There has to be that. And if I may, just to touch on the innovation aspect between governments, because we have a very nice angle to it. Just this year, we launched the Government Summit in Dubai, and 60 governments agreed to create a position that is called the Chief Innovation Officer. Then these 60 Chief Innovation Officers will be subject to the same program in terms of training to create a network of innovation facilitators between these 60 governments. So these large machines, whenever an innovative idea is requested to be pushed between them, at least there are 60 people who know each other that can push it quicker and faster. We can use that for the humanitarian sector.
Super, thank you for the concrete example on enabling. Yeah, to host government perspective.
It's an interesting, sort of thought game to try and move into the shoes of a government of a host country. And I can guarantee you that dealing with issues in some of the countries where we are active in terms of providing support, this is what we regularly do in order to make sure that, based on Joe's complex ecosystems or complex adaptive ecosystems, that we don't push the wrong buttons in trying to get the wrong results in terms of dealing with governments bilaterally. But in terms of trying to move into that position, we know and we're very much aware of the fact that these governments are juggling with a number of very real issues that they have to deal with. The public pressure on them to make sure that refugees do not take over jobs of nationals. Their economic problems, unemployment, a youth bulge, pressure on social systems, on health, on education. All of these things are very, very real and are in fact forcing most of the governments in countries where there are large groups of refugees to be more restrictive than they would actually want to be. And this is mainly a political dilemma that they're in. We know that from the discussions that we have with these governments. Now, how to help these governments get arguments in their own internal political reality to turn around some of these things, that is, I think, a trick which could be used in a better way. For instance, One of the projects that we have started in Jordan, in and around Zaatari camp, was dealing with the issue of host communities not getting the same treatment as refugees. We started the project bringing in technical advice on finding comprehensive solutions to some of the major problems: drinking water, waste management, public transport, all of them around, but focusing on the host communities first. Providing integrated solutions for host communities, and at the same time having refugees or refugee communities benefiting from the same services. It changed the whole atmosphere of thinking. First at a local level, in the governorates of Mafraq and Zaatari around the camp, and then as a second tier, it also struck a chord with the national government of Jordan about how to deal with these issues. And then all of a sudden, very new, innovative, bright ideas come out of this sort of thinking that can actually make the government to become far more cooperative. But not only that, it provides them elements that they can use in the internal political debate about why it is not really necessary anymore to be so restrictive with regard to the refugees. This is the kind of game that is indeed development or humanitarian diplomacy that is fundamental part of creating solutions in the long run. And we have done this in Jordan now. It's very interesting to see the results. And we've got the government of Jordan at various levels very heavily involved now and very positively involved, which is great. And now we're trying to do the same sort of thing in Lebanon as well. I'm very curious to find out if that'll work, because the political situation in that country is completely different. You know, with a frozen government situation, a lot of impossibilities for government to move in the way that the Jordanian government can move. So we're very curious to find that out, but probably in a year's time we'll know if it sticks or not. But this is the kind of thing which should be scaled up, I think, and it could be done in a variety of ways. But the game is always the same. As a bilateral or as an international organization, give governments of host communities munition in the debate with their internal population about why they could change their attitude without running into real trouble that people perceive.
Anita?
I'm going to stick much more to the theoretical, because it just seems ridiculous for me to try to pretend that I can think in that place. But I think that if I were the government of X country and I had 27 different donors coming to me, and I want to promote innovation in my country, and I want to promote my responsiveness to my population, I would demand a lot more coherence from the international development and humanitarian community. And I think I would say, oh, I see you've signed up to the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. Why are you proposing 17 different projects in my country that don't seem to add up to anything? I think that many developing nation or host nation, I guess we're talking about refugees in this situation, because the term host nation kind of boggles my mind where that's coming from. I'm a nation, I'm trying to develop. I don't have all the resources I need. I don't have the tax system I need. I actually think that what I would do if I were trying to be innovative is figure out a way of who are the people in my country that can actually pay taxes that aren't. And so I have some revenue, and how can I make the ministries of my government more transparent and more responsive, both internally and externally? How do I make my government more transparent, and by that way allow people to feed into it? But I think I would demand two things. I would make sure I have a transparent and publicly informed development plan, and I would ask international donors, get with the program. There are too many donors that have their idea of what should happen in a country that isn't in the top 5 priorities of that country. And I think it would be very interesting for people sometimes to say, thank you very much. That $7 million project is amazing, or 7 million pounds or 7 million euros is great, but it doesn't fit into our development plan. I hear Burkina Faso really wants that, and pass that on. And that's sort of theoretical, but I think if people did that the same way I think NGOs didn't say, I'd love to plan longer, but the donor will only give me money for a year. I think you should liberate yourselves and plan for a 5-year program and see if the money comes. It's not going to hurt you to plan for 5 years. So,
Great. Thank you. thank you. Thank you very much. And Jo has very kindly agreed to show the agility that governments can have sometimes and take both questions at the same time. So she's having a go at host country perspective, having heard the others speak, but is also, I think, turning her attention to the question on structuring the market.
So, I mean, I think the reason I was just going to propose to try to do that is because I think there are some similarities in the sense that at the moment we tend not to think very much about the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve and who those outcomes are for. And because we tend to think about providing, the way we structure incentives tend to be to provide specific agencies with a certain amount of money in order to deliver certain outputs for certain categories of people. So, you know, it's to provide wash to refugees, often on an annual cycle, to UNHCR, is the kind of the way that our current business model works. Whereas I think all round, if we could kind of flip that around and say, actually, what is the overall problem that we're trying to achieve, to address, and then have some principles within our approach to that, which could be around, these are usually long-term problems, so you need to think long-term and strategically. You need to be kind of getting better transparency in terms of the real value that you're going to get out of a particular approach, and trying to get that value for whole communities, not just on the basis of particular sort of status, and not making decisions sort of ex ante about what the best sectoral approach is likely to be. And I think if you put all of that together from a host government perspective, basically, if we were saying to the government of Lebanon, look, over the past 3 years, we have provided you with N billion dollars to provide support for those refugees, we sadly think it's very likely those people will remain in country for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Why don't we start to do a deal now around what are the outcomes that this country, Lebanon, needs to, we need to be working towards in order for that to be a viable proposition for you to keep those populations. But we're holding back from that strategic discussion. And I think equally the reason why that relates to the private sector and how you structure the market is that I think we could be a lot more agnostic about who is best positioned to deliver those outcomes. The trouble for us is that to actually manage those competitions around to decide whether it's UNHCR or another or a local government or this, our capability to manage that competition is extraordinarily limited. So we're not using market-based incentives, I think, as fully as we could. So that's the kind of link that I would see between them. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm seeing quite a bit of nodding in the panellists, so I'm taking that as being a fairly common line, but if anyone wants to come back on that after. I have a very patient lady down the front here, and we have about 10 more minutes, so after that I'm going to go back up the room, and I see already one over there in the middle.
Thank you.
Allowed to be very anonymous because it's the second day of the conference, and I assume you've met the 250 other delegates over coffee, dinner, and so on and so forth, but you may not have done. So I do apologise to our panellists for not having asked that in the first place.
That's all right. I'm Emily Arnold Fernandez. I'm the executive director of an organization called Asylum Access that works on refugee human rights and economic empowerment. And I was excited to hear the ideas that are coming out and the work that's already being done by donor governments when it comes to this diplomacy, this bilateral engagement. And I'm also appreciative of the challenges that exist and the fact that, you know, our ambassadors might have a few other priorities besides just refugee human rights. I'm wondering what you see as possibilities for donor governments or for governments in the North that are not typically host governments at significant numbers but have funding. What are the possibilities for supporting organizations that have the ability to engage governments over the long term with local staff and with staff who don't change in the way that ambassadors change with every administration? So local advocacy groups, local human rights groups that could have sustained engagement, that have a proven track record of actually moving the needle, not just being kind of the shrill protesters with their own governments, and could actually engage on these issues of breaking down the barriers that keep refugees from utilizing their full potential. Is that a possibility? Is that too political to touch? How might we make something like that work?
Great, thank you. I'm just going to give the mic a chance to get up to the middle there. Oh, and there's one down the front. So we'll go down the front and then up to the middle after that. So thank you very much. Thanks for your patience.
Hi, it's Daniel Bruce again from Internews. Just a very quick question on the private sector issue. I was listening to Justine Greening setting out in her keynote speech for the next 5 years DFID's priority areas just a couple of weeks ago, and she very much highlighted the role of the private sector, in part as funding the cash gap in terms of the unmet budget need for responding to humanitarian disasters around the world. So I just wonder the views, I guess particularly the donor representatives on the panel. Where is the role of the private sector and what are the real perceptions? Is it about just filling the cash gap or is it really about innovation? And if it is really about the latter, then I'm just mindful of some of Joanna's comments just now, how much of a challenge have we still got to tie all of these pieces together? If the donors can't do it because you're not structured to do this sort of market equity approach, who should be playing that role of deciding where the best mechanisms to respond sit?
Thank you. And for the sake of time, I'm going to take the third question at the same time, but let's not forget that we've got the issue of supporting with local people and capacity, private sector that we've just had, and we're having a third question. So.
Thank you. I'm a member of parliament in Kenya in the Human Rights Caucus, and the issue of refugees, both South Sudanese refugees in the north and the population of Somali refugees on the border with Somalia, Dadaab area, is a huge issue. And I just wanted to mention that there we don't see the level of diplomatic innovation, the intergovernmental engagement, and the political and the legal innovation that's needed to give the refugees a chance to become citizens, to get integrated. It's not a priority issue for the big nations at all. So I think it's a wasted potential, and I wanted to mention that because we've got someone from the US and we've got someone from the UK, two major partners whose voice could be heard more on this. For me as a parliamentarian on these issues, we see it's the Norwegians, the Finns, the Swedes who are taking a front line. It's when you think the top 5, top 10 agents later towards the end, maybe number 8 or 10 if I were to rank them, then the British might remember to talk about refugees, and the British ambassador is my friend. Then the Americans might remember to talk about refugees, the American ambassador is my friend. So I just wish they would step it up there, and maybe it's just geopolitical priorities, but when it's on security, when it's on terrorism and travel alerts, and now we're seeing more economic engagement, we see that. So I wanted to just mention that as a quick thing. But also to go back to one of the first things that the panel talked about was when do you get the opportunity to innovate? Because politicians want to be seen in the pictures delivering aid at the right moment when the disasters happen, but they never want to do the boring, less sexy work of preparedness. And I think from my experience, would be to think about ways to engage different levels of government, not just the executive, not just the big political leaders, but go in there and see, is there a legal committee in parliament? Is there a human rights committee? And every time the parliament changes, who are your allies there that you could get to keep the refugee issues alive, to call on for innovation and to engage them? So I'm excited, and I think there's a huge potential, especially from the big countries, but also from new powers like the United Arab Emirates, bringing in a different, place to it. So I think together we can all work, and the greatest country in the world, the US, can do more.
Okay, great, thank you. We take the statement, but I also found the question. So we have the supporting local capacity linked, I think, to your question about how to engage also at very different levels of government. So we could take those together. And then the second question on what is the real perception of working with the private sector. So let's start with the package of local capacity and different levels of government. Who would like to come in on that? Joe?
I'm happy to have a crack at it, and again, to almost try to do two for the price of one of kind of responding to the colleague from Kenya. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, and also Emily. And I guess what I find really interesting listening to you both, and also reflecting on the conversation this morning, is that in a way our theory of change in a lot of these contexts is quite challenging. So we a lot of our interventions have assumed, okay, well, if we kind of care and maintain these refugee populations, then after a while there'll be some kind of political resolution, and then they'll go home. So what we'll do is we'll care and maintain, and then the world will get a better place, and then they'll go home. So that will be good. And so we go on for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and it doesn't kind of work. And it sounds to me as though actually what I'm hearing in the room is a real need for a much more innovation in a much more political sense. And I think that was kind of very much came out as well with regard to Ebola. And I suspect that in that process of political innovation, we will need to look at the ecosystem beyond governments. And I was very struck by what Paul Wise described this morning. These are not places that are governed particularly. Most of the humanitarian contexts we're facing are where governments are actually not being very nice to their people. That's why we have a humanitarian crisis. And so I think, kind of thinking about who is actually holding on to the incentives and the quality of these political spaces is really important. And I think we probably need to be thinking more about that as part of the innovation cycle. So that, I guess that would be my response to Emily and our Kenyan colleague, is how do we innovate politically? On the private sector and kind of what's the role and who's there. I mean, I think my personal view would be, in terms of the private sector and the financing gap, that we can see quite a lot of optimism on that front, particularly in relation to natural hazards. So what we're seeing is in both the commercial sector, in terms of how you finance disaster risk, for example, in the insurance space, there's a really huge potential to be galvanized, to be bringing in political capital to address those spaces in a way that you won't be able to do with regard to conflict. And I think we're working very actively with the insurance sector and helping to convene with others some quite important deals. So I think we're kind of getting more comfortable in that space. I think we're less confident that the private sector will put up very large amounts of money to deal with conflict-related risk for quite a lot of the obvious reasons. But again, I think you're right to put your finger on the fact we need to kind of have more innovation in terms of how you're brokering these relationships. And again, the space we're looking at quite a lot is in relation to cash here. And it's quite interesting about how you can kind of bring in the private sector when you've got the government, kind of private meets public sector, managing potentially very complex areas of financial services industries, which we're not necessarily very well equipped to design on the one hand, and also some quite interesting conflicts of interest and how you manage that. So I think you're right, there's a missing piece there that would be very useful to focus more on. Thanks.
Great. I can see everybody wanting to intervene. Can we go in the line? Can we start with Mohammed and then we'll go down for once? Okay.
Really quickly on the local community engagement, I think the donors or the north part of the humanitarian players, they can definitely invest in capacity building. And I'll draw on an example again from the Syrian refugees case in Lebanon. A lot of Syrian children are left without education. And there is no capacity within the Lebanese community and the educational sector to enroll them in classes because they are in isolated areas. And they don't have teachers that could actually leave their lives behind and just come and teach these kids. But there are Syrian refugees that can teach these kids. And all that is required is not the classroom, nor funding, and rather authorization. And then if a kid finishes 6th grade, they get a certification. That does not exist. So countries in the north could facilitate some higher capacity and higher understanding of the impact of long-term investment just by allowing such interaction to happen. So these communities, again, become productive drivers in the community. If they stay, they're productive. If they stay, they're not a security risk because they are in class, they're not being recruited, they're not being engaged in theft or crime or whatever the case might be. And they could actually somehow potentially contribute to the economy. So the vast amount of knowledge and advancement in these economies and in these countries at the political, economic, and social levels can be shared with host countries, definitely. On the private sector aspect, the private sector needs to see the business case. And from a financial inclusion perspective, I think the number is quite known. 2.5 billion people on Earth are not financially included. And a large proportion of that are people who are suffering from crisis or lack of development in their countries, etc. So the plastic card companies, if I may, are seeking to penetrate these markets. So within the humanitarian realm, there is an opportunity for these companies to penetrate and create these markets, elevating the standard of living for these people, and potentially within 10 and 15 years, become actual clients that would generate profit backwards to these companies. So engaging the private sector is no longer possible under the CSR scenario or the charity scenario, but it is definitely possible under the sustainability scenario, because it includes both. It is a matter of the champions in the humanitarian sector. It is our responsibility, even as governments, to invest in creating a good business case where the private sector could actually see a long-term opportunity. Current acknowledgement, incentives, definitely. Tax exemptions, whatever you want to call it. But on the long term, they need to see that market growth and market penetration is possible. And then when they invest in crisis readiness, then they're trying to sustain their actual markets. So the shutdown when a crisis hits or a natural disaster hits is with less impact on their existing markets. Cases are there. They're few, but they're there. And they should be, they definitely need to be scaled.
Thank you. Yelta, Anita, your challenge is to try to get to your points on those last questions in a very short time. So Yelta, please.
Okay, keeping it very short. Just a reaction to trying to connect to local authorities instead of national ones. And indeed, it's true. On a local level, there's far more willingness and far more an attitude that you could actually focus on prevention and preparedness as issues. However, in the practice of working in the field, what we mostly find is that although there's a lot of willingness in local authorities, our main interlocutor as a government is the national level. And if there's no willingness to allow us to work directly with local government, it's going to be very, very messy and very difficult. So this is one of the practical problems that we run into. Just one remark about the private sector funding, because the specific question was, do we expect the private sector to fill the financing gap? If you would ask me personally, no way. Not within the existing humanitarian sector as it is. But there are very interesting possibilities if you are willing to think in completely different ways. I'll give you two examples. The last time I was in Zaatari camp, we actually went to 2 different commercially run supermarkets under the provision of WFP, but still they are there, where refugees can come with their credit cards and just buy their groceries and their vegetables and everything else. These supermarkets are commercially extremely successful. Then they are under the overall banner of Gateway, right? So it's just like any other. However, because there is no authority for commercial enterprises to do these kinds of commercial supermarkets in the refugee camps, they are still under the ban of WFP. If you would let that open, these 2 supermarkets, based on their sales, would be the most successful ones in the whole country. And they're benefiting the local economy because all of their products come from farmers and retailers, etc., in the area. So there's enormous possibilities by allowing private sector entities to take over on a commercial basis some of the things that NGOs and aid organizations are now doing. Another example, same situation. If you go into Zaatari camp, you look at the water supply system. It's run by 3 aid organizations right now. If you go outside of the camp, the local community of Zaatari has a private sector water entity which runs it very efficiently as well. Why? Why doesn't this commercial entity, because this, the camp has been there for several years now. It's a protracted situation, it's not going anywhere. There's a lot of reason to ask this private sector entity, maybe another one, to come into the camp and do it on a commercial basis. These refugees, most of them are provided with cash right now. They can pay for their services. You can make a business model which works. If you would expand this kind of thinking to the overall worldwide humanitarian system, you could make a lot of profit, and maybe then we can close that gap.
Would you like to add the last word from the panel?
I'm going to try and wipe out all 3 questions really quickly. Supporting local movements and local capacity. I think that as donors, we actually try to do that a lot. As the Soros Foundation could tell you, though, it can be dicey trying to do that. Sometimes countries don't like when you try to build local capacity that doesn't walk in lockstep with what the government is saying. So I think you have to look at that, and sometimes I think the way to go about that might be OFDA for years, it's not a political, but for years has helped local communities prepare themselves locally for disasters. We've been talking about the lack of disaster preparedness, and yes, in comparison, but I do have to say, and it's my first love in the US government, is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance for decades has been supporting local capacity for natural disaster response. And what you see, particularly in Latin America, is places where historically we would have swooped in, as we're wont to do, and we didn't have to because the government could take care of it. And that comes after 20 years of local capacity building. But in the whole scheme of things, what we were spending on an annual basis for 20 years is nothing compared to what you can spend in 7 weeks responding. So we are doing that on some level. I would say it might be easier in some ways. I would like to see more think tanks in developing countries. And I think that maybe that's something we could do a little bit more of. Private sector for cash, no. I think that we have to be better about looking at not the private sector as, woohoo, free money, but what is it you actually do, and how can that be useful for the ends we're trying to achieve? Or how can that be useful for the ends that people locally need? And stop spending hours upon hours upon hours responding to their booty. Donors are bad enough. We're trying to get better about reporting. I think all of you that get money from donors and foundations, et cetera, maybe need to push back a little bit on all this boutique reporting that you have to do for one private company or for one foundation. Be bold. And I'm so glad to hear you think we're the greatest country in the world.
That's a good way to end up.
I know that our president and your country have a little bit of history, which is I'm very proud that that's the case. But I do have to say, because I don't know the ambassador to Kenya personally, I had to look up his name real quickly, thank God for the Wi-Fi. But of the 5 highlighted topics on the website, U.S. ambassador attends World Refugee Day celebrations in Kakuma. So, no offense to the ambassador. Yes, he probably could have pushed a little harder, but there's a very nice speech about what Kenya could be doing and what they're doing. So I would say that as you know from WikiLeaks, the U.S. government loves cables. We still write them. We're pretty good writers too. So I think that I can forward-channel and maybe back-channel to the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi to push a little harder. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anita, for ending us on that tone. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful set of panelists. They, I think, have shown the agility and the intellectual capacity, the openness, and the connectedness which we hope to see. And it can be quite a thankless job being a government representative. So if we can think of giving them an all-star style